The water did not rush. It seeped, a slow, dark miracle in the cracked gray pan of the earth. It rose from a wound the horns had made, a steady, patient pulse of life where for a year there had been only dust and the baked bones of the land. 15 longhorn cattle stood around the growing puddle, their great heads lowered, not with thirst, but with a kind of placid ownership. They had made this. Their hoofs, sharp as spades, had broken the seal of clay. Elspeth knelt, her hand hovering over the surface, feeling the cool breath of it on her skin before she dared to touch. Around her, the world was silent, save for the whir of heat locusts and the soft, grateful sighs of the beasts. It was not a river. It was not a well. It was a seep, a secret the land had kept, and it was enough. It had to be. 1 year earlier, the laughter had been as dry and brittle as the September grass in the auction yard. It wasn't cruel laughter, not at first. It was the sound of men who knew the unforgiving arithmetic of their world, watching someone get the sum badly wrong. Elspeth stood alone, a woman of 28 who looked younger, her hands clasped in front of her worn dress, as the auctioneer tried to find a price for the dregs of the Circle T dispersal. "What am I bid for this fine collection of hat racks?" he'd bellowed, sweat staining his collar. 15 head of authentic Texas Longhorn, the pride of a bygone era. All they need is, well, they need a miracle. But who's got one to bid? The laughter rolled again. The cattle were a joke. In an age of heavy-bodied Herefords and Angus, bred for meat and docility, these were ghosts. They were all bone and horn and wildness, their hides a patchwork of roan and dust and dun. They were too old, too lean, too mean. They were walking scrap, and everyone knew it. Everyone but Elspeth. She raised her hand. A silence fell, thicker than the dust. The auctioneer squinted. "The lady bids," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The lady bids $1 a head." Marcus Sterling, whose own sleek red cattle had fetched top dollar all day, turned to the man beside him and spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "Poor woman's bought herself 15 ways to starve to death." Elspeth did not look at him. She looked at the cattle. She saw the steady, intelligent light in their eyes, the way they stood against the sun, unbowed. They had a stillness the other cattle lacked, a self-possession that spoke of survival. She had $100 to her name, saved from years of mending and washing for other families, and a deed to 60 acres of hardpan clay nobody else had wanted. The land was poor, the creek a seasonal memory. The arithmetic was indeed unforgiving. But she saw something else, a different kind of calculation. The final bid was $15. The auctioneer banged his gavel with the air of a man getting rid of a bad smell. "Sold! To the lady with more hope than sense!" As Elspeth went to sign the bill of sale, Sterling approached her, tipping his expensive hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slick with false concern. "A woman alone. This is hard country. Those animals will eat you out of what little you have, and then lay down and die. Let my men drive them to the boneyard for you. I'll even give you your $15 back. A gift." She met his gaze, her own as calm and steady as the Longhorns. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But I believe I'll keep my purchase." She signed her name, the ink scratching on the dry paper, and walked away to claim her herd. The long journey to her plot of land was a slow, thirsty procession under a white-hot sky. The town watched her go, a solitary woman followed by 15 living skeletons, and they shook their heads. They knew the math. They were sure of the answer. The first weeks were a trial of sweat and silence. The 60 acres were just as advertised, mostly clay, cracked and barren, with thin stands of mesquite and brittle grama grass. The fence was a ruin of rotted posts and rusted wire, her first and most urgent task. Day after day, she worked until her hands were raw, digging new post holes in the baked earth, stretching wire until her shoulders ached with a fire that lasted long into the night. The Longhorns, to her surprise, were no trouble. They did not test the new fences. They did not stampede or fight. They moved across the land with a slow, deliberate purpose, grazing on things the pampered Herefords would have scorned: the thorny brush, the bitter weeds, the tough, dry leaves of the mesquite. They seemed to understand the bargain she had made. They asked for little, and in return, they endured. She named them. Not all at once, but as their personalities revealed themselves. The old lead cow with the wide, sweeping horns and the calm, watchful eyes became Dust. A brindle steer with a crooked horn was called Traveler, for he was always at the farthest corner of the pasture. A young red heifer, skittish and quick, was Flicker. She gave them all names, speaking them aloud in the quiet of the evenings as she sat on her porch step, watching them settle for the night. The names were a private defiance, a way of turning a purchase into a partnership. The town's judgment followed her home. Riders would pass on the road and rein in their horses, staring at her ragged herd. "Still alive, are they?" one would call out, meaning it as a pleasantry. "Keeping them hides clean for the tanner?" another would joke. Marcus Sterling made a point of riding by once a week, his own fat red cattle grazing contentedly on his irrigated pastures across the road. He would sit atop his fine horse, a portrait of prosperity, and look upon her work with an expression of pity that was sharper than any insult. He never spoke, but his presence was a constant reminder of the town's verdict. One person alone, a woman alone. It could not be done. It was not. In the third week, as she was wrestling a new post into the ground, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, his clothes clean but worn. He was leading a burro laden with firewood. It was Mateo, who lived in a small adobe house a few miles down the creek bed. He was from the old country, and people in town mostly ignored him, treating him as another relic, like her cattle. He nodded at her, then looked past her to the Longhorns. He watched them for a long time, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw how they spread out, never overgrazing one spot. He saw how they browsed the scrub, leaving the sparse grass for later. Finally, he turned back to her. His English was accented, his voice gentle. "They are not foolish, these old ones," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Elspeth, unused to a voice without mockery, simply nodded, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. "People forget," Mateo continued, his gaze drifting back to the herd. "The land teaches, but only if you listen. These cattle, they have been listening for a long time. The old ones remember the land's secrets. You listen with your eyes, mija." He touched the brim of his hat and moved on, his burro plodding patiently behind him. The words settled into Elspeth's tired bones, a balm against the town's scorn. Listen with your eyes. She had been, but now she would listen harder. She was not just a keeper of cattle, she was a student of survival. Summer arrived like the open door of a furnace, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy white. The methodical rhythm of Elspeth's days took hold. Before dawn, she was up, checking the fences, checking the cattle. Her work was a litany of small, crucial tasks. Clearing prickly pear from the paths, hauling water bucket by bucket from her shallow, unreliable well, mending the harness for the old mule she'd bought with the last of her money. She learned the language of her herd, She saw how dust would lead them to the shade of the mesquite grove during the hottest part of the day, where they would stand motionless for hours, conserving every drop of moisture. She saw how Traveler would use his one good horn to hook branches and pull them down for the younger ones to strip of their leaves. They were a community, a slow-moving, self-sufficient society, and she was their steward. By June, a boy started appearing at her fence line. He was Finn, the blacksmith's youngest, a scrawny child of 10 with eyes that were too big for his face and a thatch of sun-bleached hair. He never said anything at first. He would just stand and watch the Longhorns, mesmerized by their size and their strange, placid dignity. Elsbeth, guarded by nature and by circumstance, watched him back. One afternoon, she was struggling to clear a patch of particularly dense catclaw brush. The thorns tore at her clothes and her skin. Finn, without a word, slipped through the wire and began to help, pulling at the stubborn roots with his small, wiry hands. From then on, he was a fixture. He was quiet but tireless, and he loved the cattle with a fierce and uncomplicated devotion. He learned their names and their habits. He'd bring them bits of apple core he'd saved, holding them out on a flat palm for a long, rough tongue to sweep away. He was not afraid of their horns or their size. He saw what Elspeth saw. Not 15 walking skeletons, but 15 survivors. "Why'd you buy 'em?" he asked her one day, his voice barely a whisper, as they sat in the shade watching the herd. "Everyone says they're no good." Elsbeth considered the question. She thought of Sterling's sleek Herefords, bred to be simple, efficient machines for turning grass into beef. They were an answer to a single question. Her Longhorns were different. "They know how to live here," she said finally. "They know things we've forgotten." It was the truest thing she had ever said. She was beginning to understand what Matteo meant. She listened with her eyes, and the cattle taught her. They taught her which plants held water in their roots, which insects signaled a change in the air, how the slant of the morning light could predict the heat of the afternoon. She was keeping them alive, but they were teaching her how to live on this hard, forgotten piece of land. The town saw a lonely woman and a silent boy wasting their summer on a fool's errand. They saw worthless cattle on worthless land. They did not see the lessons being learned. They did not see the quiet bond forming between the woman, the boy, and the beasts. They did not see the small, secret victories that were adding up, day by patient day. August arrived, and with it, the stillness. The air grew heavy and thick with heat, but the clouds that promised relief never gathered. The sky remained a vast, empty bowl of blue. The dust, once settled by the morning dew, now never slept. It coated everything in a fine, gritty powder. The dry spell, a common enough worry in this part of the country, began to feel different this time. It felt personal. It felt like a judgment. The creek that marked the southern edge of Elspeth's property, always low in summer, shrank to a series of stagnant pools, then to a ribbon of damp sand, and finally to a pale, crooked scar on the land. Her own well, shallow to begin with, began to yield less and less with each turn of the crank. The water came up cloudy, tasting of mud and effort. This was when the arithmetic began in earnest. In the dark of her small cabin, long after Finn had gone home and the cattle had settled, Elspeth would sit at her rough-hewn table with a stub of a pencil and a piece of scrap paper. The numbers were stark. So many gallons of water per day for the herd, so many for her and the garden, so many days until the well ran dry, so many bales of hay she could afford versus how much grazing was left. The columns of figures were a prayer against despair. She refused to despair. She adjusted. She hauled water in the cool of the pre-dawn before the sun could steal it. She taught Finn how to cut the pads from the prickly pear cactus, and she would spend the evenings burning the spines off with a torch, tossing the singed, fleshy pads to the cattle. They devoured them, the moisture within the cactus a precious supplement to the dwindling water supply. It was a secret she kept guarded, a piece of knowledge earned through observation. No one else fed their cattle cactus. It was considered starvation fodder, a sign of failure. To Elspeth, it was a tool for survival. One afternoon, Marcus Sterling rode up to her fence, not on his usual weekly pass, but with purpose. He dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the dust of her land. "Elspeth," he said, foregoing the more formal ma'am and using her name with a familiarity she did not welcome. "This drought is going to be a bad one. There's no feed, no water. You can't possibly hope to get those animals through." He gestured at her herd. They were lean, it was true, but their coats were not dull, and their eyes were clear. They looked far better than they had any right to. "I'm renewing my offer," he said, his voice a low, reasonable murmur. "I'll take the land, give you a fair price for it, enough to get you back to the city where you belong. A woman alone shouldn't have to face this." It was the same condescension, wrapped in a blanket of false concern. He wasn't looking at the cattle, he was looking at the land, imagining it empty, imagining his own herds expanding across it. He saw her as an obstacle to be removed with pity. She looked from his confident face to her cattle, standing quietly in the heat. She thought of the numbers on her scrap of paper. They were frightening, but they were her own. "I'm not selling, Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was as quiet as his, but it held a different quality. It held the firmness of a root that has found its hold in hard ground. He stared at her, his smile tightening at the edges. "Pride is an expensive luxury, ma'am. You'll see." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the dust to settle in his wake. That night, Elspeth added a new line to her arithmetic: the cost of pride. She decided it was a price she was willing to pay. Winter came, but the rains did not. The season turned with a cold, dry wind that stripped the last leaves from the mesquite and sent dust devils dancing across the barren fields. For other ranchers, the winter was a time of reckoning. The price of hay skyrocketed as demand outstripped supply. Men who had laughed at Elspeth in September were now selling off their breeding stock for pennies on the dollar, their herds too large to feed through a long, dry winter. The road past her property saw a steady, sad traffic of thin cattle being driven to the railhead, their owners' faces grim with failure. The mockery that had followed Elspeth for months faded, replaced by a strained, communal anxiety. No one had time to laugh at her anymore. They were too busy counting their own losses. But on Elspeth's 60 acres, a quiet miracle was unfolding. Her 15 Longhorns, the walking scrap, were proving to be masters of scarcity. They continued to browse on the woody scrub and, with the spines burned away, feast on the endless supply of prickly pear. While Sterling's Herefords stood huddled by hay bunks, their red hides stretched tight over their ribs, Elspeth's herd ranged across her land, their long legs carrying them effortlessly over the rough terrain. They were not fat, but they were strong. Their resilience was a puzzle to anyone who bothered to look. She kept her methods to herself. The nightly ritual of burning cactus pads was done in the gathering dusk, the flames hidden by the low roll of the land. It was hard, smoky work. The tiny, hair-like spines, the glochids, would get into her skin and clothes, an infuriating, persistent itch. But when she saw the cattle chewing contentedly on the scorched pads, she knew it was worth it. This knowledge was her capital, more valuable than the money in Sterling's bank. It was a secret kept like a coal banked low under ash, glowing with a private heat. Finn remained her steadfast partner. He was small enough to slip through the dense brush to find the best patches of cactus, and his sharp eyes were better than hers at spotting the telltale signs of a den of pack rats, whose stored caches of beans and seeds provided another small, vital source of forage. He understood, with a child's simple clarity, the importance of their secrets. If Mr. Sterling knew about the cactus, he'd just laugh, Finn said one evening, his face smudged with soot. He'd say it proves you're starving them. Let him think what he wants, Elspeth replied, her voice calm. We know the truth. Being right was its own kind of reply, quieter and more satisfying than any argument. The arithmetic continued, but the numbers began to shift. The hay she had was lasting longer. The cattle were holding their own. The equation was no longer just about survival. A new variable had entered the calculation: hope. She allowed herself to feel it only in the deep quiet of the night, a small, warm thing cupped in her hands. She was not failing. Against all odds, against all logic, against the entire town's collected wisdom, her fool's errand was succeeding. It was a victory no one else could see, and for that reason, it was all the more precious. She was one person alone, but she was not beaten. Not yet. Spring was a cruel mockery. The sun warmed the earth, and a few stubborn wildflowers bloomed, their colors a desperate shout in a landscape of brown and gray. But the sky remained stubbornly, brilliantly blue. No rain fell in March. No rain fell in April. The ground grew harder, the cracks wider. The last of the stagnant pools in the creek bed evaporated, leaving behind a crust of curled, pale mud. The town's anxiety curdled into something sharper: fear. The communal well in the center of town was now rationed, the water level dropping daily. Men gathered at the general store, their talk no longer of cattle prices, but of ruin. They spoke of leaving, of giving up on the land that had betrayed them. Marcus Sterling was the most vocal. His irrigated pastures, fed by a deep well, were also failing. The well pump, once a steady heartbeat, now coughed and sputtered, bringing up more sand than water. He had already sold half his herd, the prize-winning Herefords he had paraded with such pride. The remainder were gaunt, their eyes dull with thirst. His prosperity, which had seemed as solid and permanent as the courthouse, was revealed to be a fragile thing, dependent on a steady supply of water he had always taken for granted. One day in early May, a trail boss named McCoy was moving a small herd of tough, rangy cattle north. He stopped in town to inquire about water and pasture for the night, and was met with grim faces and shaken heads. Someone, with a last flicker of gallows humor, pointed him toward Elspeth's place. "Go ask the bone lady," the man said. "She's got 15 head of ghosts out there. Maybe they drink dust." McCoy, a man whose face was leathered by sun and experience, rode out to Elspeth's farm. He found her and Finn mending a section of fence. He did not laugh. His eyes, accustomed to judging cattle in all conditions, swept over her herd. He saw their lean frames, yes, but he also saw the clarity in their eyes, the way they moved with purpose, the faint sheen on their hides. He dismounted and walked to the fence line, his gaze lingering on Dust, the lead cow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy from the trail, "I ain't seen cattle hold their flesh like this in 500 miles. What's your secret?" Elspeth looked at this stranger, his face honest and his eyes respectful. She saw no mockery there, only professional curiosity. "They're good foragers," she said simply. "They know the country." McCoy nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his eyes. "They're old blood," he said. "They remember how to be cattle. The new breeds, they've had it all bred out of them. They're soft, helpless." He pointed with his chin toward a young, well-built steer. "I'll give you $40 for that one. Right here, right now." That's twice what a prime Hereford is fetching at the railhead. The offer hung in the air, a stunning validation. $40 was a fortune. Finn's eyes went wide. Elspeth felt a tremor of triumph, sharp and sweet. It would be so easy to say yes. The money would solve all her problems, fill her columns of arithmetic with black ink. But then she looked at Flicker and Traveler and Dust. They were not just assets to be liquidated. They were her partners. They were her teachers. "Thank you, but he's not for sale," she said, her voice steady. McCoy looked surprised. Then a slow smile spread across his face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Don't blame you, ma'am. Don't blame you one bit." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving behind something more valuable than $40. The first public acknowledgement that her madness might just be wisdom. By July, the land was gasping. The sun was a hammer, and the world seemed to shimmer and distort in the waves of heat rising from the baked earth. The whine of insects was the only sound in the dead, still air. Wells all across the county had gone dry. Marcus Sterling's was the latest to fail. The pump brought up a final gasp of sandy mud and then fell silent. The heart of his operation had stopped beating. His remaining Herefords, their sides heaving, stood listlessly in their barren pasture, their broad, fleshy tongues lolling from their mouths. They were bred for abundance, and in a world of scarcity, they were dying. Sterling's pride had curdled into a cold, raw anger. He saw Elspeth's continued survival not as a curiosity, but as a personal affront. He saw her walking her fence line, her thin frame wiry and tireless, and his resentment grew. He saw her cattle, still on their feet, still foraging, and it felt like a judgment against him and everything he had built. He began to talk in town, his words poisoned with desperation. He spoke of old water rights, of surveying errors, whispering that her small, pathetic well was somehow drawing water from his own aquifer. It was a baseless claim, born of a frantic need to blame someone other than the sky or his own poor judgment. But in the fever of the drought, some people were desperate enough to listen. The fear in the town was now a palpable thing. It had a smell, like soured milk and dust. It had a look, in the hollowed-out eyes of the women and the tight, grim set of the men's jaws. Elspeth saw it most clearly in the face of her nearest neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a proud, hard-working farmer with a wife and 3 small children. He had always been civil, if distant, but now he could not meet her gaze. She saw his wife in town, her shoulders slumped with worry, buying only flour and beans. Their garden was a patch of withered stalks. Their milk cow had gone dry. One evening, as Elspeth and Finn were returning from checking the far pasture, they saw Mr. Henderson standing by their shared fence line. He was just looking at her cattle, his hands clenched on a fence post. There was a look on his face of such profound, defeated longing that it made Elspeth's heart ache. He was a good man being broken by the world. He saw her and flinched, turning away as if caught in a shameful act. He did not ask for help. His pride was all he had left. Elspeth knew then that the arithmetic was no longer about her own survival alone. The numbers now had to include her neighbors. The equation had grown larger, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous. The crisis was no longer just about water or grass. It was about the fraying threads of a community coming apart under a relentless, unforgiving sun. Her small, secret success had made her an island, but the tide of desperation was rising all around her. It began with a change in the cattle. For a week, they had been restless, moving about the pasture with an agitation that was foreign to their nature. Dust, the old lead cow, was the most unsettled. She would stand for hours facing northwest, her head raised, her nostrils testing the dry air for a scent that only she could detect. She would pace the fence line, her low, guttural moans a sound of deep disquiet that vibrated through the still evening air. Elspeth watched, and she listened with her eyes, trusting the instincts of the animal more than the empty promise of the sky. She knew this was not simple thirst. This was something else. A memory, a purpose. On the third morning of this restlessness, Dust did not wait. At first light, she walked to the gate and stood there, her great horns framing the sunrise, and waited. When Elspeth approached, the cow looked at her with an unnerving, direct intelligence, and then turned her head pointedly toward the barren, unused corner of the property. It was a place Elspeth had ignored, a wide, shallow basin of cracked gray clay where nothing grew, not even the hardiest scrub. It was the worst part of her worthless land. "What is it, girl?" Elspeth murmured, resting a hand on the cow's bony flank. Dust moaned again, a low, insistent command. Taking a breath, Elspeth unlatched the gate. What happened next was not a stampede. It was a procession. Dust led the way, not to the well, not to the cactus patch, but directly to the center of the barren basin. The other 14 Longhorns followed in a silent, single file. They walked with a strange certainty, as if being pulled by an invisible string. Elspeth and Finn followed, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and wonder. The herd stopped in the very center of the clay pan. For a moment, they stood motionless, heads lowered as if in prayer. Then Dust lowered her head further, nudged a specific spot on the ground with her nose, and began to paw at the earth. The clay was baked as hard as brick, but she scraped at it with a steady, rhythmic motion. Soon, Traveler joined her, his own sharp hoofs digging at the ground, then another and another. The 15 Longhorns, who had stood so placidly for a year, were now digging with a frantic, shared energy, their horns and hoofs breaking up the baked surface of the earth. "What are they doing?" Finn whispered, his voice full of awe. Elspeth didn't answer. She could only stare. They were digging a hole, a wide, shallow crater in the hardest part of her land. It seemed like madness, and then she saw it. In the spot where Dust had first begun to dig, the disturbed clay was a different color. It was not gray, but a deep, dark, chocolatey brown. It was damp. As she watched, a tiny pinprick of water welled up, a single, glistening tear on the face of the land. Then another. A dark patch spread, a puddle formed. From the wound the cattle had made in the earth, water was rising. It was slow, it was muddy, but it was unmistakably, miraculously, water. It had worked. The old ones remembered. The news traveled with the speed of desperation. By noon, a small pool of muddy water had formed in the crater the Longhorns had dug. Elspeth and Finn worked tirelessly, using spades to widen and deepen the hole, shoring up the sides with rocks. The flow was not strong, but it was steady, a constant, patient seep from a hidden spring the cattle had sensed deep beneath the clay. The water was life, and the sight of it drew the townspeople like moths to a flame. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons. They stood in a silent, stunned circle at the edge of the basin, their faces a mixture of disbelief and raw, naked hope. They stared at the water, then at the 15 Longhorns standing nearby like sentinels, their work done. The creatures they had mocked as hat racks and ghosts had become saviors. Late in the afternoon, Marcus Sterling arrived. He did not come on horseback, but in his buggy, as if on official business. He pushed his way through the small crowd, his face a mask of grim authority. He stared at the Seep, his eyes narrowed, calculating. "This is a tributary of the main creek," he announced, his voice loud and carrying. "The water rights belong to the properties downstream. My property." It was a lie, a desperate grab for control. The creek bed was miles away, and this Seep was its own entity. But he was a man used to being believed. "I'm filing a legal claim," he continued. "Until the circuit judge arrives, this water is to be considered a contested resource. No one is to touch it." A murmur of protest and despair went through the crowd. To be shown a miracle and then have it forbidden was a unique kind of cruelty. Elspeth straightened up from her work, her clothes soaked with mud and sweat. She faced Sterling, her spade held loosely in her hand. She was not angry. She was calm, filled with a certainty that left no room for fear. She did not argue with him about legal claims or water rights. She simply ignored him. Her gaze went past him, to the crowd. She saw Mr. Henderson standing with his wife, his face etched with a pain that was more than just thirst. She saw the other families, her neighbors, the same people who had laughed at her, who had pitied her, who now looked at her with a terrifying, fragile hope. This was the final column in her arithmetic, the moral choice. She could hoard the water. She could sell it for an exorbitant price, making herself rich from their desperation. She could become as ruthless as the land itself. Instead, she looked directly at Mr. Henderson. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "The price of water for your family and your stock is 1 day's labor a week from you, helping me keep this seep open and fair for everyone. That's the price for anyone who needs it and can work. For those who can't, for the elderly or the sick, the water is a gift." A collective breath was released by the crowd. It was not charity, which their pride would have refused. It was a fair bargain, a price measured in sweat, not silver. It was a path to survival that preserved their dignity. It was an act of profound and radical generosity. The community was reforged at the edge of that muddy pool. The next morning, Mr. Henderson arrived at dawn with his 2 eldest sons, their shovels ready. They were followed by half a dozen other men. They worked together under Elspeth's quiet direction, expanding the seep, digging channels, building a stone trough so the animals could drink without fouling the source. The sound of their labor, the scrape of shovels, the clink of rocks, the low murmur of men working with a shared purpose was a kind of music. It was the sound of a town saving itself. Marcus Sterling was left isolated by his own greed. His legal threats were empty air against the reality of people working to survive. He watched from a distance, his face tight with fury, as the woman he had dismissed as a fool became the quiet, undisputed leader of the community. His power, built on money and influence, had evaporated in the heat. True authority, Elspeth was learning, came not from what you owned, but from what you were willing to share. That night, Sterling made his final, desperate move. Under the cover of darkness, he took a shovel and tried to dig a diversion trench, a shallow canal to bleed the water from the seep and send it downhill toward his own property. But he was not as quiet as he thought. Finn, who had taken to sleeping in Elspeth's barn to be near the Longhorns, was awakened by the sound. He crept out and saw Sterling's frantic, shadowy figure digging in the moonlight. The boy ran, not to Elspeth, but to the Henderson farm. Within the hour, a dozen men were standing at the edge of the basin, their lanterns held high, their faces grim. They caught Sterling red-handed, a thief in the night. He was not met with violence. He was met with a silence more damning than any blow. He dropped his shovel and stumbled away into the darkness, exposed and shamed, his reputation ruined forever. The seep sustained them through the rest of the summer and into the fall. It was not abundant, but it was enough. It was a lesson in scarcity, in cooperation, in the true meaning of wealth. When the rains finally came in late October, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned the dust to dark, fragrant mud, no one celebrated with wild abandon. They stood at their doors and watched it fall with a deep, quiet gratitude. The drought was broken, but the memory of it had changed them. Elspeth was no longer the strange woman alone. Her 60 acres of hardpan were no longer scorned. She was a fixture, a respected elder in all but years, a woman who had listened to the land when no one else would. One afternoon, Mateo came to visit. He stood with her by the edge of the Seep, which was now a small, clear pond fringed with new green shoots. The 15 Longhorns were drinking deeply, their reflections shimmering on the surface. They were magnificent, their horns catching the light like polished silver. "You see, mija?" Mateo said softly, a smile in his ancient eyes. "I told you, the old ones remember the land's secrets." Elspeth watched dust raise her head, water dripping from her muzzle, and look out over the healing land. She had listened with her eyes, and she had been answered. She had bought 15 ways to starve, and they had taught her and her entire community how to live.